Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Clifton. I'm Gallup's CEO, and welcome to Gallup's Great Hall. Our mission here at Gallup is helping people be heard. And it's something that our founder, George Gallup, spent almost 50 years of his life, and now we've spent almost 100 years doing exactly that here in the United States and around the world. In fact, when he started his journey in helping people be heard, he started with politics. And many of you now know one of the most famous indicators in politics is the presidential approval rating. And that's what he kicked off. But interestingly enough, that's not the thing that George Gallup was most interested in. In fact, in the 1950s, famed American broadcast journalist Edward R. Murrow was interviewing George Gallup. By the way, the interview is so dated that Edward R. Murrow actually had smoked a cigarette during the interview. But he said to George Gallup, of everything that you've studied, what is it that interests you the most? And George Gallup said back to him, happiness. And that's exactly what we're focused on here today, understanding what it means to have a great life here in the United States. And George Gallup actually had a famous line where he once said, again, this was back in the 50s, but he said, there are 5 billion ways to lead a life, and we should study each one of them. Now we've been doing that in over 150 countries every single year. And the reason that the work that Andre Perry and Jonathan Rothwell have done together with Gallup and Brookings is so important, because there's a trend that Gallup has uncovered that has us very concerned. And the only way to reverse this trend is through great research like this. That trend is that when we ask people about the anger, the stress, the sadness, the pain, and the worry in their bodies every single day across the world, it's been steadily rising for a decade straight. The pandemic did not cause today's pain, it exacerbated it. And so for us to better understand it, we cannot do it through traditional economic indicators alone. We must do it through the very story of every single individual person. And that's the research that they're launching today. So thank you all for being here and listening and helping us on our mission to help people be heard. I want to turn it over now to Amy Liu, the president of Brookings, who is the one that's behind a great deal of this research. Thank you again.
I decided to use the podium or the step up just so I can see you all. Thank you so much, John, for that introduction, and thank you to you and your team here at Gallup for hosting this event today. We are immensely grateful for the path-breaking research collaboration between Brookings and Gallup, as you mentioned, and particularly between Andre Perry and Jonathan Rothwell. Their latest work together is the centerpiece of today's event, and the centerpiece of a new effort focused on the well-being of Black communities and other historically excluded groups. This is why I am thrilled to welcome all of you to our event today, because we today are officially launching a new collaboration between Brookings and John Legend's HUMANLEVEL to further bend the moral arc of racial justice, so that the economic, social, and mental well-being of every member of our communities is strong. This partnership is rooted in the firm belief that data and narrative change can fuel the efforts of community stakeholders and their government, private sector, and philanthropic partners to make the systemic changes needed to strengthen racial equity across America's cities and America's communities. And if we do that, if we support and lift up their efforts, we can inspire wider reforms, including improving the life prospects for other racial and ethnic groups too. And it is that potential to build a thriving, multiracial, multi-ethnic society centered on their well-being that is most exciting to me about this partnership between Brookings and HUMANLEVEL. I am deeply appreciative of John's commitment and vision for this work. Now, let me say a few words about our two organizations. John Legend's Human Level, as its name implies, is about supporting people level and local level change to achieve racial equity across the country. In addition to his Human Level initiative, John also has launched the Free America campaign to change the conversation surrounding criminal justice policies and to end mass incarceration. I agree. It is truly an honor to work with someone who is so fully committed in words and deeds to building racially just and strong communities. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge John's other accomplishments in his other day and night job. John is an Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, Tony award-winning singer, songwriter, and a pianist. Yes, that's... And you're going to be hearing more from him today. For our part, Brookings is a nonprofit that uses our research, our reach, our relationships to improve policy and governance at the local, national, and global levels. And as we do, we have a deep commitment. We have a deep commitment to ensuring that our workforce, our research agenda, our policy ideas, our networks reflect the highly diverse communities and global societies that we strive to improve. We are especially indebted to the leadership of Camille Busette and Andre Perry, who on their own and in their partnership and in their leadership with scholars, other scholars that are here in the room from Brookings, they collectively are working on behalf of the institution to make sure that we are focused on racial inclusion and shared prosperity. In fact, the work underway at Brookings reflects a belief that addressing the structural challenges faced by women and men, urban and rural areas, working poor whites and Native Americans and Hispanic and Latino communities and other racial groups, they're not zero-sum. In fact, improving the well-being of all marginalized people, starting with the long overdue work to strengthen Black communities, is at the heart of a vibrant society and a healthy democracy. So thanks again to John for this partnership. I also know that we are not alone. The Brookings Human Level Partnership is benefited by the complementary and critical work of all of you in this room. And I know including a lot of folks that work with Brookings here, from the NAACP to I saw the Biden administration PAVE initiative and many others. You wouldn't be here in this room with us if you were not fellow travelers. So I want to thank you all, because it is our collective, unyielding work that will ensure that we bend that long moral arc towards racial justice. Okay, now on to today's program. Today's event marks the first in a series of events that we look forward to hosting with Human Level. Today, we will feature new analysis that serves as the foundation for this partnership, and we will hear from community leaders. And I want to especially thank Ronell, Bree, and Lorella for their tireless efforts on behalf of their residents and for being here today. To say more about today's program and partnership, I am pleased to turn things over now to Camille Busette. Camille is the Interim Vice President and Director of Governance Studies at Brookings. She also is the Director of the institution's Race, Prosperity, and Inclusion Initiative, which is a priority cross-cutting effort. Please give a warm welcome to Camille.
Thanks, Amy. I am thrilled that all of you have joined us here today, and so let me add my very, very warm welcome. So many of you might be wondering why the Brookings Institution and Human Level are gathering everyone here on a Saturday morning. So what could be so important that we wanted you here in the beautiful Gallup building, thank you, Gallup, Well, we are here to make a very bold statement. And that statement is that we can only achieve equity in this country if everyone in every community that makes up the beautiful mosaic that is the United States experiences well-being. Our claim is that universal and sustained well-being is the indicator of having achieved equity. Now, you might be wondering why well-being is the final measure of equity. Well-being is the state in which individuals and communities feel secure in every sense of the word: physically, psychologically, and socially secure, food secure, housing secure, and opportunity secure. Why is this important? Numerous studies and well-considered research have demonstrated that an inequitable society has enormous costs for the U.S. economically and in terms of social cohesion, for poverty rates, and for child development. And just in case there's some doubt, and I don't think I really need to state this, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here. We have not reached a point in the U.S. where all communities are experiencing well-being. This event today, along with the new report that Andre and Jonathan Rothwell from Gallup, and with some guidance from John, have published, are part of Brookings' new partnership with HUMANLEVEL, a nonprofit initiative funded by John Legend that aims to uplift communities disproportionately impacted by racism. Our two organizations will work together to develop innovative policy research that seeks to disrupt, dismantle assumptions, institutions, and pre-existing public policies that have prevented Black, Brown, and other marginalized communities from thriving. Our approach will build on assets of those communities and on showcasing and learning from community leadership. And in fact, Brookings is currently leading a project which asks communities themselves around the country to define well-being. So it is fitting that our first convening with HUMANLEVEL is to discuss well-being in the U.S. and to hear from three experts who are innovating to ensure well-being in communities across the U.S. For this morning's discussion, you will hear from my colleague, Andre Perry, who will present data from a recently completed survey of well-being. And as part of the partnership, this report and others will provide research and analysis for community leaders and policymakers to help elevate places and enrich the lives of people throughout our country. We will then have a discussion led by John Legend with Fuse Fellows, Ronelle Hempton, who's the Principal Equity Strategist, City of Los Angeles, and a former Fuse Corps Executive Fellow, with Bree Jones, Founder and Chief Executive Officer of Parity, and with Lorella Praeli, Co-President of Community Change. We are all looking forward to a very interactive and dynamic discussion. And with that, I will hand things over to my esteemed colleague, Brookings Senior Fellow, Dr. Andre Perry. Andre?
Good morning. How are you? All right. No, really, how are you? That's everything. This presentation is, we're discussing, we need to talk about well-being. And I first wanted to thank my colleague and friend, collaborator, Jonathan Rothwell. Since I arrived at Brookings, he's been a collaborator, and I could not have done this work without him, so I just want to give him his just due. Please give him a round of applause. And it's not often I get to open up for John Legend, so I'm just going to take full advantage of this situation. I wanted to talk about how did we get here. A few years back, we started this whole series of research on devaluation. A lot of people know me from our research around housing devaluation, where we found that homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced by 23%. about 48,000 per home, accumulating about 156 billion in lost equity around the country. And we know that 156 billion equates to about 4 million black-owned businesses based upon the average amount black people use to start their firms. It would have paid for more than 8 million four-year degrees, covered nearly all of Hurricane Katrina damage. It would have replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times over. It's more than double the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis. It's a big number. And it's one of the reasons why I say, like it keeps my teeth white, there's nothing wrong with black people that ending racism can't solve. When things go wrong in black communities, we blame black people, right? We don't look at the structures that extract wealth and opportunity without anyone wearing a white hood or carrying a tiki torch. So we did all of this work really outlining that there are structures that extract wealth and opportunity. My good friend Derek Hamilton, who's the foremost expert on this issue, articulates that almost every day. And then that policy research led to structural change. I have Lisa Rice here, who is working with the National Fair Housing Alliance, and their work on the ground led to policy change. Melody Taylor with HUD and the Property Appraisal Valuation Equity Task Force is here. A lot of work has been done over the course of really 2 years that's really remarkable, right? But that led us to look at what we found is homes and businesses and infrastructure are much more valuable than they are priced. It's a metaphor for how we live. And so I want to say, if that's the case, let's look where people are thriving. Let's look to see what's going on in those places. Let's see if these assets are strong, maybe their work is really changing things. So then we started to develop the Black Progress Index, and we're looking at life expectancy and the social determinants of health. And what we found that there are many cities where life expectancy is much higher than it would be predicted. And the theory is there's something on the ground that's happening. Like there's civic action on the ground that's making those numbers outperform what you would expect. So we need to learn from those places, and that's how we ended up on well-being. So I just want you to think for a moment, because well-being is like this lofty concept that is hard to really grasp. But I want you to think, where is the happiest place on earth? Don't say Disneyland, particularly the politics in Florida right now. Don't say Disneyland, but what's the happy place, your happy place? And don't say the shower. Just think about, more importantly, what city makes you the happiest and why? Is it the housing prices? Is it your church? Is it your communal networks? Is it your fraternity, sorority? Is it the fact that you can see someone that looks like you? What makes you happy in that place? That's well-being, all of that, all of those things. Well, now here's a definition. Well-being can be understood as how people feel and how they function both on a personal and social level and how they evaluate their lives as a whole. Now, it incorporates all of the material and immaterial goods that influence one's life. So what we're very good at think tanks is capturing the socioeconomic data. What we're absolutely horrible at, and I include my organization, the many universities out there, we're constantly showing where black folk fall in comparison to white folk. In education, in housing, and knowing that it's somewhat an apples to oranges comparison, given the wealth inequalities and discrimination that have occurred over time. So, but all of these things matter, right? It incorporates that. But I actually want to see those social networks, that cultural impact, all of those different things. So it incorporates that. Also, we need to look at impact. You know, and I say this as a think tanker. We prescribe many policy solutions that, but if you look from a well-being perspective, they're not having impact. So we need to hold ourselves accountable by looking at what people think is working for them, right? In addition, we need, and it's particularly if you can walk to a car that looks like yours and get shot? We need some evidence of well-being in terms of racial cooperation and community cohesion. We need to show signs of progress in that regard. Because if I don't care how wealthy you are, if you're at risk for going to a wrong car, that's a problem. That's a problem. So, but how do you measure it? Let me tell you, Gallup since 2006 has been a leader in measuring well-being, chiefly through this method where they ask people in their current state and 5 years from now, how are they doing? And you can rank from 0 to 10, 0 to 4 is suffering, struggling in that middle range, and thriving 7 on up. So we use that metric to establish a lot of the data that you're about to see. And then we combine Gallup's Well-Being Index with Black Voices data. So we have the longest continuous time series of life evaluation data by race and ethnicity ever produced. So what you're getting is, really cutting edge stuff. This is new, this is fresh. So let me get into the data. Major finding. Now, on an international level, the United States actually falls in the top 20 with 48% of respondents say they were thriving. So internationally speaking, we're generally thriving as a country, right? So the darker the blue, the more that you are thriving, you feel that you are thriving. You can see some European countries, North America, South America, so and Australia, and so we have that. So, but let's drill down a bit. Let's look across racial groups. Between 2008 and 2023, well-being fluctuated, but declined during the COVID pandemic. And since 2020, all racial and ethnic groups experienced a sharp drop in well-being. Let's look at that, particularly Asian Americans. That one bright orange line, that's Asian American, but you can see it's fluctuating. I don't want to put too much, that might be some error in the data, but there was a significant decline around Asian groups, no question about it. Okay, deaths from alcohol, drugs, and suicide. That's what we call the deaths of despair. That's the new age term that we use for those findings. And we've seen a sharp fall in well-being since 2016, and again after the pandemic. And for the first time, you see blacks dying from deaths of despair, particularly suicide, at rates of whites for the first time. American Indians and other marginalized groups, smaller populations, are suffering at the highest rates, and we'll see this line right here, the gray, represent our Native American brothers and sisters, and you can see right here white and black converging in deaths of despair. They're increasing. Declines in well-being. Now this is what's very interesting and something we got to deal with. Declines in well-being have been especially pronounced among young people, people 18 to 24, both among all racial groups and within racial groups. Let's take a look. This is young people in each racial category. So from 2008 to 2016, you saw a drop to 2017 to 2019, and a big fall from 2020 to 2023, right? Young people struggling. And you see it within every racial group. So among whites, among smaller ethnic population, among black people, the adults versus the young people, you see the disparity. Young people are not feeling good about their state of being, which doesn't bode well. I mean, what is the American dream? This hope that young people are doing better than the prior generation. That's the hope, but we're not seeing it there. Okay, where happiness resides. Let's look at the areas in which they reside, the places. Now, the highest well-being scores were on the West Coast and in the South, North Carolina and Georgia in particular. And areas with the lowest scores are clustered around the Great Lakes, the Appalachians, and the Northeast. So let's take a look. Those darker colors, that's where well-being is high. Those lighter colors, that's where it's low. And you can see how they're scattered, but I'm going to break this down for you a bit. People are pointing, looking for their hometown. It's cool. I'll let it sit. I'll let it sit. But top 10. Now this is collective. This is all the racial groups combined. You got Utah, islands of Hawaii. You got the DMV represented. Lawrence. That's right. That's right. I joke. I say if there's a Wakanda in the United States, it's the DMV. And that's going to empirically hold up. I'm going to show you in a second. I don't speak anything but facts. Boulder, Anchorage, State College, a lot of college towns. Yeah, you know. Let's see. Bottom, Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And you see a lot of deaths of despair in these places. A lot of people dying because of deaths of despair, low optimism in these places. And they varied. Steubenville. Yes. Now let's break it down a little bit. In each racial category, for Asian folks, Charlotte, Phoenix, Columbus, Ohio, Orlando, Hartford are places where people feel good about themselves. Black folk, Huntsville. Oh, represent. And see, this is what's interesting. A lot of people will see a lot of problems in Birmingham. But something's going right in Birmingham for people to feel good about themselves, right? For black folk, Hispanics, Provo, College Station, a lot of Texas, people feeling good about themselves. Other racial groups, largely Native American, multiracial, Albuquerque, Austin, Anchorage. White folks love Hawaii. You know, I know y'all going to Hawaii. That's a long trip for a lot of us, though. Now, look, Washington, D.C. is represented in many different groups. Something about Washington, D.C. that clicks, right? Now, what's interesting, this is where it holds up empirically. Atlanta, that last Wakanda forever, Latinos and blacks, getting along in Atlanta, right? I mean, y'all got to feel me on the, I'm hitting you with the. Again, white folks loved the islands in Hawaii. And black people are thriving in small and mid-sized cities. The larger cities, and this is confirmed in some of our other data where we found that density is negatively correlated with life expectancy. Generally speaking, we think of density as a good thing because you get better education, better jobs, but for black people, it is a negative correlate with life expectancy. So it's consistent with our other data. Now, I did not want to show any wonky slides because this is a layman's audience, but I did want to show this. This is why diversity is a strength in cities. On that x-axis, that bottom row, that's the diversity index. That's diversity. Diversity is increasing. On that y-axis, that's thriving. What we see is places become more diverse. Thriving goes up, right? And I don't know what that is. Maybe it's having the ability to see yourself and others in a city. there might be signs of cohesion happening, but that's something to explore. And too often, and this is, I'm going to close out here soon, but too often we focus on what's wrong in cities. That's where we can look for what's right, right? Now, future research. We're going to continue to measure structural racism. I just want to be clear that we believe that in order to change society, you need to dismantle this architecture of inequality. That has to happen. So we're going to continue to break down these barriers. But we're also going to look at those social determinants that impact well-being and longevity. But here's the thing. We're going to incorporate well-being in a ways to get at those assets that aren't picked up by wealth, by income, by other things, right? Because if we can get to those community level strengths and assets that are certainly making change at a local level, then we can scale them up. Because remember, a lot of our exclusive practices didn't start in Washington, D.C. They started at the local level. Redlining started in Baltimore, yes. Right? It was codified and resourced by the federal government. So just as exclusive policies can start at the local level, inclusive policies can as well. You can clap that up. All right? So that's what we're going to talk about right now in a panel discussion. The people who are actually dismantling this architecture of inequality. And I'm going to bring up our esteemed panel, led by who John Legend will lead us in the discussion. I'm going to bring up Camille Bousset, who you met earlier, Interim Vice President, Director at Brookings Governance Studies, Ronell Hampton, Principal Equity Strategist of the City of Los Angeles and an Executive Fellow of Fuse, Bree Jones, Founder and Chief Executive Officer of Parity, myself, you got Lorella Pirelli, Co-President in Community Change and Community Change Action, and last but not least, John Legend. And John is going to say a few words before we enter a panel discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. Thank you, Dr. Bousset. Thank you, Amy, and the entire Brookings institution for hosting us, doing the great work that you continue to do to help us understand what's happening in our cities, in our nation, in our world. I want to explain a little bit about what Human Level is. It's an extension of the work we started doing on the criminal legal system and how to end mass incarceration and reform the way justice is served in this country. And we started it in 2020. If you remember what 2020 was like, it's quite a year. Of course, the pandemic began during that time. We also saw a lot of protests around George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and a lot of folks marching for the hopefully uncontroversial claim that Black Lives Matter. And of course, those marches were provoked by police killings. And of course, we've been talking about ending mass incarceration, but as the research has shown, as all the great work that Brookings is doing is showing, there's a lot more to well-being than our interactions with the police and with the criminal legal system. And we need to think more holistically about how we ensure better lives for all of our people. And so we decided we were going to focus on local government, on the human level, on the people level, in the communities, in the neighborhoods, with the activists, with the community. And so Human Level, our goal was to take a deeper look at these issues, focus on actions that city leaders can take to tackle systemic racism. We started Human Level with an incredible organization which is represented here. It's called Fuse Corps. Fuse Corps is here. James is here, their fearless leader. And we've got some Fuse Corps current fellows and former fellows here. And they've been working in cities for a long time, placing fellows into communities and trying to work with the mayors and the local leaders to solve problems. And we're fortunate to have some current and former Fuse fellows participating today, including Ronell Hampton, who is sitting right here on this stage. We'll hear from Ronell shortly, and he's going to speak about his experience as a Fuse fellow in Los Angeles. And I wanted to join today's conversation because I believe that only when we have defined our destination can we begin to plot the path forward. In this conversation and through collaboration, we can start to paint a hopeful, honest, achievable picture that declares to the world, this is what equity and well-being actually look like. That means every time we talk about an injustice, a systemic failing, or a broken institution, we also tell the story of what the world could look like if we came together to solve the problems. And it means centering the efforts of those working to find those solutions and lead us from the unfree country we live in now to the free America we all deserve. Now, decades of advocacy and research continue to help us understand what systems aren't working, from housing to education to the criminal justice system. But to progress, we've got to go a step further and envision alternate paths toward our end goal. And that's what we're going to talk about today with our esteemed panel. I'm very excited to welcome them and speak with them. I'm going to go sit over here, and we'll get our conversation going.
Very good. As was mentioned, we're going to have a conversation led by John Legend, who asked this illustrious panel a few questions.
All right, my first question is for Bree Jones. Now, earlier we learned that communities need much more to thrive and achieve well-being than brick and mortar buildings. Bree, your firm, Parity Homes, acquires and rehabilitates abandoned properties in Baltimore to buy the block and create affordable home ownership opportunities. So I want you to tell us about Parity Homes. What do you do? How does buying the block connect to well-being?
Hello? Okay. Well, first I want to say it's such a pleasure to be here. And thank you so much, Andre, for always just being a champion of mine and, supporting me in so many ways. So thank you for that. And good afternoon, everyone. It's so good to see a lot of familiar faces in the crowd. My name is Bree, and I'm the founder of Parity, which is a 501c3 that, as John said, acquires and rehabilitates abandoned buildings. And I started Parity as a response to the gentrification that I experienced in my hometown. I saw that oftentimes Black communities first, for decades, struggled with disinvestment and disrepair because of intentional policies. And then once housing prices and land values got really low, suddenly we see investors come in, buy up all that land, gentrify the community, and push people out. And so I asked myself, is there another way? And so, sorry, are we getting a little bit of feedback? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Here we go.
Testing.
They're working
Okay.
on it, yes.
All right. And so Parity's approach is that we work in communities that are still facing the brunt of disinvestment. Baltimore City has about 15,000 vacant buildings. There's hyper vacancy, and so we acquire those vacants block by block, and we renovate them. When I went to go raise capital for this, we kind of got laughed out of the room because investors said that the model would never work and that no one with a choice would choose to live in West Baltimore. And inherently, I felt like that was not true because I knew I wanted to live in Baltimore, and I felt like they were describing my Black community where I grew up. And so I kind of just went to people who would listen, and I was like, hey, if we could renovate these buildings, would you want to live here? And unequivocally, the answer was yes. And so before we even had a single dollar in capital and before we owned a building, I had 8 people who said, hey, if you can get these houses on this block, we'll move in. And so now in just a few short years, we have 40 collective members who are in the process of buying their home, and we have a wait list of over 600 people. And I'll wrap up just to kind of tie it to the topic of well-being. The first is that at Parity, we really try to broaden the understanding of wealth. It's not just about monetary wealth, which we do know that housing directly contributes to wealth, the equity that you hold, but it's also your physiological health, it's your political power, it's your environment, it's green space, do you have clean air and clean water, but it's also your social capital and your social connectedness. All of those things tie into well-being. And so with Parity, because of our social capital, because our homebuyers are getting to build relationships with their neighbors before they even move in, we're finding that that is really the distinct factor that's making this model work and scale.
Fantastic. And you said you're working with 40 families right now? Wonderful. And
we actually have a homebuyer in the crowd if you want to say hi. Okay. Raise your hand.
Wow.
Yes.
So what's the structure when you went out to raise capital? What kinds of contributions were you relying on, and then how does this propel forward and scale up?
Yeah, so at first we were trying to raise traditional capital, from Wall Street that comes at like 12% interest, just typical capital structures. When you're trying to do reparative work, you can't work with extractive capital sources. And so we kind of took a step back and leaned really heavily into our story and our mission. And we got approached by JP Chase through like a very small kind of private RFP. They were launching a Black homeownership initiative. So I got an email randomly that said, hey, we want you to apply for $2 million. Oh, hi, Stuart. Hi. We want you to apply for $2 million to help create more Black homeowners. And I was kind of like, is this a Nigerian prince trying to scam me? I don't know. So I had to verify that it was actually a real email, and I applied. And we got the funding, and it's 3-year funding that's really allowed us to, one, try and get our feet beneath us. And I talk a lot about the fact that when it comes to Black funding, we're expected to be perfect right out the gate, whereas white men who are going for VC funding, when they fail, it's actually seen as a sign of success. And so this funding has actually allowed us to fail and iterate and get better. And at this point, we've really taken off because we've had that patient capital.
Fantastic. Yeah. So how can policymakers, like leaders in the city, other policymakers and other organizations, how can they work with you, help support your organization?
So in 2020, I was able to work with Senator Antonio Hayes, who is based out of Baltimore, to bring forward to the state of Maryland a bill called the Appraisal Gap Bill. The appraisal gap it's a little bit nuanced from appraisal bias, which is kind of like the cousin. But appraisal gap is in Baltimore, where the majority of properties are severely dilapidated. It oftentimes costs more in construction to repair the homes than the bank will actually appraise it for when it's all said and done. The gap can be anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000, and that's partially what prevents projects from happening. So the appraisal gap bill passed at the state, in Maryland State. Governor Westmore just signed it into law on Monday. Thank you. We still need him to fund it, so if you know him, send him a text message. But if and when fully funded, it would create about 800 new homes, specifically in historically redlined communities. So it's one of the first economically reparative bills in the state of Maryland. And then at the federal level, there's a Neighborhood Homes Investment Act bill that was proposed by Senator Ben Cardin that I've been really hoping that moves forward because it would do something similar at the federal level for homeownership.
Fantastic, thank you. So, Dr. Perry, you and your colleagues were recently in West Baltimore as part of another Brookings project you're working on, along with local community development colleagues in Cleveland and Detroit, studying community-led investment approaches in Black majority commercial corridors. So can you talk about your experiences in the context of what it means for people and communities to be thriving, and what are you seeing there that is similar or different to Bree's approach in Baltimore?
Well, first and foremost, my colleagues Tracy Haddon Lowe and Jonathan Rothwell, we wrote a paper maybe a year ago looking at the devaluation of commercial real estate in areas. And one of the striking findings is that 80% of all commercial real estate is owned by 1% of households in the United States. You know, you can compare that to only 16% of residential properties are owned by that top 1%. About 40-something% of all wealth generated from property comes from commercial real estate. We talk about home ownership, but we know that those commercial corridors are oftentimes the lifeblood of a community. It's the soul of the community. Yeah. When you're in New Orleans, it used to be Treme in that area where you could get goods and services and go to restaurants. And when the highways was constructed over top of it, you eradicated wealth, opportunity, and culture. And so our work in Baltimore, Cleveland, and Detroit really focuses on how can we buy back the block in the way that Bree, because I get this quote unquote steal ideas all the time. Bree's work is phenomenal. We, alongside my colleague Stuart Yasgur at Economic Architecture, we had a challenge where we asked entrepreneurs to develop proposals that we would then fund in ways to scale. But we see all across the country people demanding new forms of ownership. If you live in certain parts of this country, it's almost impossible to own a home. And be a teacher, be a nurse, be single. So we need new ways to own property. And we need cities to participate. We forget that some of the largest landlords in most places are cities themselves. They own the land. They own the properties. And instead giving them away not giving them away, but selling for pennies on the dollar, we can zone for inclusion and density. That's what's happening in places like Atlanta and other areas where they're really trying to give people the opportunity to own. And for people, and in particular, for people who are the descendants of the enslaved, ownership means something different. And so to own a home, to own a business, certainly that's wealth creation, but it's also about self-determination. It's about power. And so for me, we are seeing all across the country through community land trusts and other forms of community ownership, that's what we're seeing people want and creating, and we need to fuel that innovation.
Fantastic. Well, I want to talk with Ronell Hampton now. So Ronell's in Los Angeles, and I want to know a little bit about the work you're doing in Los Angeles.
Yes, thank you so much for the question, John. Super grateful to be here, and it's awesome to see some of my Fuse core folks in the audience as well. A little bit about the work that I do in Los Angeles. I have to give a shout out to Fuse Core because that is what brought me to the city of Los Angeles. They recruited and found me and brought me on to do a project for the city of Los Angeles, LA Civil Rights Department. And I was charged with building out the Office of Racial Equity, a 5-year strategic action plan. And one of the components that was critical was community vision alignment, right? Oftentimes, in order to work within municipality space, you have to go with the directions of the electeds, right? They give you a motion through some legislation, and then you take action on it. With that motion, it really gives me what I call the authority to take action, right? But the action of building out the plan requires a community vision alignment. And so a little bit about what I do for the city of Los Angeles, I develop alignment across stakeholder groups to ensure that when we are being responsive to directives from our electeds, it's aligned with the most impacted communities that will be the end users to whatever programs, projects, and services that come out of that direction. Some of the projects and programs outside of building out the Office of Racial Equity that has come out of our work are the LA Repair effort, and it's a participatory budget project. $10 million was allocated, $8.5 million will be distributed to 9 repair zones. We identified these repair zones by doing quantitative data analytics using geographical information systems to understand where the most impacted concentration of certain issues like overcrowded housing, the digital divide, food insecurity, environmental injustice like air quality disparities were happening. And once we identified that, we created the LA Repair Program to reach out to the communities and receive ideas from the impacted community members of what they wanted to address where they lived, right? And so we were able to get them to identify the most prevalent issues around transportation and housing, air quality issues, but they also gave us the ideas for solutions, projects and programs and services that they felt would be responsive to their needs where they lived. And we then reached out to the community-based organizations in their communities and had them develop proposals that were responsive to the ideas that we collected from communities. And right now, the communities are voting on those ideas, those proposals, right? And so the proposals that the community votes on will be funded. And this is this full circle collaborative process of ensuring that, again, once we get that directive from council, that we're building the response and collaboration with the folks most impacted by the issues, right? And that's critical. And I feel we are modeling best practices of what this can look like. We understand that the government has played a very intentional role in creating a lot of the inequities experienced at the local level. So we rely heavily on our community-based organizations to repair that trust, right? And to build reach and capacity so that our services, our programs can reach the folks most impacted. But we know we cannot do that by ourselves, right? As a municipality, we have to do it in partnership and collaboration with residents, community-based organization, and small business owners.
I'm so curious. So, thank you. So what are some of the ideas that the communities are coming up with that are getting funded?
Yeah, so they're really interesting. I would say that a third of the ideas came for housing. Right, and that was some really interesting data to come out of this, right? And so when we're talking about addressing the needs of our community, we have to find better ways of understanding how they see their needs. And so when we got that data back and we saw that a third of folks were looking for housing, supportive housing, looking for financial aid, right, to pay for their rent. What was really powerful to see is the solutions that came from the community-based organizations, right? And so they came up with these powerful proposals that were like rental assistance programs, also support with folks who are applying for housing. Those hand-on support services, I think, are lacking in the digital world that we're in. Oftentimes, we think if we post it on our social media or if we send out a mass email, we're reaching the people. And what we found is, through the collaboration with community-based organization, that personal touch is super, super critical. And a lot of the programs that we're seeing being proposed are really filling that gap of that personal touch and ensuring that not only are we making resources and program services available, that we're helping people navigate accessing them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let's talk to Lorella. Lorella Praeli is here, and Lorella, you are the co-president of Community Change, a national organization founded by leaders of the civil rights, labor, and anti-poverty movements. Community Change partners with grassroots organizations across the country to build power with and for the people most marginalized by injustice. So, Lorella, what brought you to this work, and can you tell us a little bit about the connection between childcare and well-being?
I really wanted to make possible what someone else did for me. Growing up undocumented, I lived with shame, fear, and at times a sense of hopelessness. And it wasn't until I met other young undocumented people who were trading shame for pride, who were trading fear for a commitment to deliver a different world, that I began to see that I too had the agency to win, to fight for more, to demand what we deserved. And that's really our most important work at Community Change, partnering with organizations around the country that are working at the very local level, trying to assess what people really need, trying to help people find their voice, because everyone's got their voice and they know what they need. And we're working very hard to ensure that people understand that the barriers that we face are structural in nature and they're by design. And as such, that people have the tools and the power to change those things. And so that brings me to this question about what is the connection? How do we tackle the connection between childcare and well-being? And I am a new mom to a 3-month-old Amara.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about families and parenting and children and how our government makes it impossible for families to thrive, for parents and children to thrive, even though we know what actually makes a difference in people's lives. And so, and they do that when they neglect to see childcare as a public good, when they neglect to see it as something akin to basic health care that everyone should deserve and have access to, and when the systems that we have in place pay the people we ask to take care of our most precious children poverty wages. Now, John, we know the data tells us that the kind of care a child has access to in the first 3 years of their lives will have enormous impact on their ability to speak, on how they see themselves in the world, their hearing, their social emotional well-being, their skills. We also know that childcare providers, whether they are paid or not, are the ones who make it possible for parents to do their jobs, to contribute to their families and their communities. We also know that childcare is one of the biggest, sometimes the biggest expense for parents of young children. And yet at the federal level, in Congress, our leaders have chosen inaction. Wow. But here's where the states come in, because that is precisely where the ground is shifting. In New Mexico last year, Latinas and working class women with one of our partners, Ole, had a transformational win that was 12 years in the making. I want to come back to 12 years in the making. They won a constitutional amendment to guarantee a permanent funding source that's $150 million a year for childcare in perpetuity.
Amazing.
Right? Like, I just want people to think about what that means. That will guarantee that childcare is affordable for every parent, and it will also guarantee that the people who are providing that care, which is disproportionately women of color in these places, actually get paid a living wage. And they won that with more than 70% of the vote. And that should tell us something given our current politics in the United States of America. Now, if New Mexico can do it, and New Mexico is one of the poorest states in our country, if they can find a funding source, then other states can do that, right? So that's really our takeaway here, that at the state and local level, the ground is shifting, and it's because people are fed up, but they're also saying, I want to be a part of making that change possible.
Are you seeing other states look at this as a model, and are you seeing it working its way through the legislatures in other states?
Yes, so Minnesota, Columbus, Ohio, and I would
My home
say,
state.
yeah. And in the next few years, I think we're poised to see change in California and Oregon and Maine and in other parts of the country, where people are really holding this kind of long-term vision in place and a commitment to really seeing things through.
Do you think there's beginning to be more of a sense in the country that childcare is something that is a basic good that everybody needs and that should have, public funding?
Yeah, I think that the pandemic helped to shed more light into the kind of challenges that people who are less resourced, but I'm talking about like high resource people really struggle to make it work.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a different conversation that we're having about care and the role of care in our lives, starting with, right, our children.
Yeah.
And an understanding, I think, that it really is setting them up on a path to succeed or to not succeed. And that government can actually step in to change that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Let's bring back Camille Bousset. Camille, as you mentioned in your remarks earlier, you're leading a research project to develop a community-led definition of what well-being is, some of which you've alluded to here today. So what are you hearing directly from community members about what it means to be well?
Well, thank you, John. First of all, I want to say I am so energized by sitting next to such amazing innovators in Bree, Renelle,
Yes.
and Lorella. So one of the most disempowering things is to have somebody else define success for you. So when somebody else defines well-being for you, you are always at a disadvantage. And yet, as we've seen here in this panel, there are so many assets, so many ideas. Our communities, they're still here despite all the structural impediments. So we team with ideas and enthusiasm and innovation. And the purpose of this project is to say that communities should define what it means to experience well-being. We're going to start with defining well-being for Black young men. I'm doing this project with my colleague, Dr. Keon Gilbert, who's over there. If you can just raise your hand, Keon. We all know that, unfortunately, we continue to see how much Black men and Black young men in the United States are discriminated against, are the target of police shootings and a range of other kinds of violence. And so we wanted to start to talk to communities about what it means for those young men to thrive. And we want those young men to come up with their own definition of well-being. And that's where we're starting. We are going to expand that project to a variety of other communities. And our goal is, within the next 3 years, to have a community-led definition of well-being where communities can see themselves and know that they are the ones who are leading the change in what it means to thrive.
Thank you. That's very exciting. I'm curious, we've talked a bit about housing, and when we think about well-being, do we have any research, Dr. Perry, perhaps on the correlation between housing security and well-being?
Oh, absolutely. Again, we did research on longevity, and we found that housing is home ownership is one of the biggest predictors of longevity. And so the more people can own homes, and that it's not just about it is about shelter, security, but understand that home ownership is also a driver for other sectors, education, policing, all of those other things. So if we can increase home ownership, no question, we improve the quality of life for everyone. And now I also need to acknowledge this, that home ownership should not be the only way. My colleague Derek Hamilton is in the house. We need another, a different type of social security system. Baby bonds is another solution that we can institute because, and I just want to be clear, not everyone's going to own a home, but everyone should have an opportunity to build wealth. And so we need other pathways for home ownership, and we need to expand our social safety net.
Thank you. Now, in our final minutes, we're going to do a speed round. We're going to have each of our guests up here tell us in their own words and their own thoughts if the audience here today could leave with just one message on how to create change at a local level to improve well-being for individuals and communities. What would you prescribe? What would you suggest for our guests today? So I'll start right here with Lorella.
It's a great question. I would say commitment to that vision and long-term strategy and steady patience, right? This New Mexico example was 12 years in the making.
12 years.
So change takes time. And organizing. So help people find their political home, their place of connection, and help people understand that they have the tools to be demanding more from their elected officials and their government.
Thank you. Ronell?
Yes, thank you for that question. I would say we all have experiences. As a society, we really promote academic and professional experience, but each of us have a lived experience that is very powerful and brings value to any space you take up. So share your lived experience, and the last thing I'd say is seek the vessel and be the vessel, right? Seek the vessel means whatever resource you need is available, you just gotta seek it, right? Find that person who can connect you to it. And be the vessel means you are now that person, right? So once you see someone in a position of need, they're trying to access the resources that you now are aware of, be the vessel for them.
Bree?
Oh, that, plus one to that. And so I think, the first political unit was the tribe, was a group of people who were geographically tied to one another and who had to work together for survival. In many ways, the neighborhood, the block has become that. So organizing amongst neighbors, social capital and social connectedness, and building movements, I think is really how you tip the scale. But with the digital advancements, we don't have to be literally next to each other. So building community in general, in whatever form that may be, is I think the way that you really build political power.
Thank you. Thank you. Camille?
I would just add to that, we all have a responsibility to make this place a better world. And I think all of us who are here can look around in all the spaces you occupy and see who is not there and make sure those people are invited in.
And Andre?
Yeah, I'm going to get a little bit wonky. The GSEs, the government-sponsored enterprises, about a year and a half ago, announced that they were going to incorporate rental payments in their underwriting practices. That enabled banks to expand their special purpose credit programs, meaning they can offer mortgages without a down payment. The way that wealth inequality really shows up in the home owning process is a lack of down payment. You have, and Makeda Henry Nicky really shows me this through her good work. She shows me how there's so many invisible prime borrowers. People are doing everything right. We rely on grandma for all our credit services in so many ways. But there are so many people doing everything right, living a life of rent year to year to year, never missing a payment. Those are the invisible prime borrowers. We're not talking about 2007 or 2008. We're talking about giving a new mortgage product to people who deserve it. And so for me, it is also about demanding that banks at your large-scale banks, people who are in the mortgage business still, expand their special purpose credit program and in ways that can unleash a new generation of homeowners at the local level.
Well, thank you. I think I think we've all learned a lot from each of you, and we appreciate all the work you're doing and everything you've shared with us today. And I think it's clear how important it is to start at a human level, at a community level, at a neighborhood level, to get the kind of change we need across this country. And I'm so glad that you all are doing what you're doing, and we're going to try to learn from what you're doing, spread the word around the country, and raise up more of these examples so that we can continue to increase and improve the well-being of all of our citizens. All of our citizens deserve to live happy and healthy lives, and we're going to work to do that. All right? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
I think we stay put.
So while we have you here, we wanted to open up to Q&A, so
Oh, that's
questions.
right.
Yeah.
I apologize.
And so we have folks who are running mics here. It'll be helpful if you use the mic. So put up your hands, and we would be very happy to take your question.
And please introduce yourself.
Oh, sure. Thank you. This was wonderful. My name is Joe Scantlebury. I'm the president and CEO of Living Cities. And I'm very curious to know.
Tell us about what you do.
Okay. Well, I did wanted to ask the question, but I didn't want to talk about us.
Folks are clapping for you. I would love to know what.
I see this. I'm surprised. So Living Cities is a collaboration of foundations and financial institutions, all of whom committed to advancing racial equity through economic inclusion and building the economy of the future. We do a lot of innovation and experimentation work in cities. We try things, we fail sometimes, we share that knowledge. But at the end of the day, we believe that everybody in American cities, everyone, should be able to live an economically sustainable life, thrive, live in abundance, and more importantly, be connected. So that's what we're all about.
Thank you. And what's your question?
Sure, thank you. Loved you in JC Superstar, by the way. Anyway.
Thank you.
My question is, I'm curious if you could all speak to the role of capital, both the access to capital as well as the barriers that you face to capital. And I wonder if you could share a bit about that. Bree, you hit it right on the head, so I appreciate that. But I'm curious what solutions you see around access to capital, because that is how we think wealth building has to how you expand wealth building, by really improving and removing those racialized barriers to capital. Thanks.
Well, speaking of capital, I know Living Cities put some money out, so I'd love to talk to you after this.
On time.
Right. Never miss an opportunity. Take every shot. Access to capital. One thing I say about when it comes to funding Black and brown and women entrepreneurs is that everyone wants to be the first to be second. So you have a lot of people who are like, well, that's a good idea, let's see. But then as soon as you get that one funder who tips the scale, everyone is on the bandwagon after that. And that's what happened with my organization. So I think for folks in the room who are funders and who are sitting at that side of the table is to be the first. And also to be okay with, you might not get your money back. Because when you think about Black, brown, and women funders, we're the first sometimes in our families who are doing this. We don't have generations of guidance and, oh, this is how you build a business. We didn't, grow up in our grandfather's companies doing internships. Some of us might have, but not all of us. And so I think whether it be, like if you're private capital, then work with a philanthropy who can give you a loan loss reserve so that you have a little bit more of, a risk tolerance. Also, let's think about how the notion of risk is racialized. Andre, you kind of touched on that. For low-income Americans, your rent and your cell phone bills, you pay those consistently, but they're not reported to credit bureaus. And so just, I think, again, I spoke earlier about extractive capital. The tools of the master will never dismantle the master's house. So we have to be thinking about new economic tools to move capital to people who have been excluded from it.
Can I just quickly add this, and I don't want to poo-hoo philanthropy because there's a role for philanthropy. We're also just not going to nonprofit our way out of this problem. Right? This is an issue, particularly over the last few years. We've seen trillions of dollars poured out without the teeth to direct the capital to people who've been denied it. One of the reasons why my colleague, and again, Derek Hamlin and I are working on this equity scoring piece to score the way. Instead, we score fiscal policies all the time and against their impact on a budget. But we don't look at the distributive effects of that capital on various ethnic groups. We have to demand that money go from the federal government, state governments, go to people who deserve it. And again, and this is, I can't say this enough, and this comes out in our home value work. And Jackie Priestley, who organization doing a lot of good work on appraising in Prince George's County. We also need just to eliminate discrimination. It is robbing families of generations of wealth. Sometimes I certainly believe in reparations. I believe we are owed. I also just want for people to get what they deserve, right? And so for me, it is about let's make sure that taxpayers, all taxpayers, get the funds that they deserve through the programs that should be targeted, but also let's remove those barriers that prohibit wealth creation, because most people start their businesses using the equity in their home. Most people use their 401k to initiate that. I just want folks to have $100,000 in the bank in some way. So for me, it's not necessarily about saying philanthropy do this, and certainly corporate America has to do their role. But I also just see a role for federal government if we're going to really close some of these wealth gaps.
And Andre, I have my mic, right? Okay. I just wanted to add, and the time's also now, these trillions of dollars are actually moving to the states through our major wins and breakthroughs at the federal level, and they have the potential to really set course and to determine who has power in the states, who has power to shape where that money goes, who gets access to those resources, and different states and localities can get creative about what they use those funds for, right? So on the issue of childcare, there were many of our partner organizations around the country who, when ARPA money went out the door last year, they said, wait a second, that is I want $21 million from that pot of money to go to childcare, early education. And so there are opportunities now, and making sure that we develop the systems in place for that money to go to the right places is of utmost importance right now.
One thing I'll add to that conversation is contract eligibility. A lot of folks, if the money is available, will not be able to access it if they're not eligible for the contract, right? If they don't have their DUNS code, their cage number, right? So those are the things that I feel we need to put more energy into, building a pipeline of contract eligibility for the Black-owned, woman-owned, minority-owned, disadvantaged businesses to access this funding. One of the things that we're trying to do in anticipation for the Olympics coming to LA is really have that conversation, but it definitely needs to be scaled up, because barriers to contract eligibility is the reason why Black-owned businesses are not at the table. They have the vision for the work, they know how to do the work, but they're not contract eligible. So that's something I will offer to this conversation to address contract eligibility.
Thanks very much for that. We're going to take 2 more questions because I want to be very respectful of your time. We'll take them both and then answer them. So these 2, okay, great. We'll take 3. We'll take you guys, both of you guys over there. Yeah.
Ethan Hawker. I'm the Institutional Giving Coordinator with the Center for American Progress. So I'm originally from Evanston, Illinois, which is the first city in the United States to create a direct reparations program, offering funds and credits for housing and mortgage payments to anyone who either experienced it directly or is a descendant of someone who was discriminated against by racist housing policies and redlining. These programs are important and need to be implemented with a far greater reach and scale, How do you think major cities need to approach creating these type of programs in a way that is effective, equitable, and also long-lasting?
Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
Have
you all heard about what happened in Evanston?
Yeah. So what we'll do is we'll take all three and then answer.
Okay.
So the young lady in the blue.
That's you. That's you.
That's you. Do we have a mic for her?
Okay.
I think she.
Okay, sir, go ahead.
Tell me what to.
No. We want to hear from you.
Great. Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm George Askew. I'm the president and CEO at the Meyer Foundation. And in the Meyer Foundation, we invest in the folks who are at the front lines of trying to dismantle those racist systems and structures that have been oppressing Black and brown people for decades, for eons, of course. One of the things, I've been in the job for about a year, just over a year. And one of the things that I've struggled with, and we do this work in the DMV, in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. One of the things I've been struggling with as part of our vision is about a thriving community, a DMV where everybody thrives. And it wasn't until today when Andre talked about well-being that I kind of had that aha moment. But it looked at, well, folks, it looks like, Black and brown folks are thriving to some degree in DC. But is there a significant well-being gap that exists in DC, and is that something we should be aiming at addressing? And if so, what are the leverage points? What are the leverage systems that actually could close that well-being gap? And Dr. Brissett, I wanted to ask you, the work that you're doing, are you doing it nationally or are you doing it locally so that we could be a partner in that work with you?
Great, thank you. So we have a question on reparations and scaling that. And then a question on the well-being gap, and I'm happy to take the question about the research just with you privately after the session.
Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roxy Ndebumadu, and I am Mayor Pro Tem. For those of you who are not familiar, that's Vice Mayor and Council Member for the City of Bowie, Maryland, and Prince George's County, Maryland. Andre, I know you were talking about Prince George's County up there. Yeah. But my question is, what do you all think that local government should be doing now? You say the time is now, and I'm asking this question somewhat selfishly because we are in budget cycle, that's number one. And number two, you have a lot of constituents in this audience who are going to go back to their communities and be civically engaged. And when you talk about demanding and holding people accountable, I want to understand, what do you think we should be doing now so that we can take that into accountability and continue to take that forward? And then also, just really quickly, I have my delegate in the audience, Kim Taylor, so I just wanted to shout her out too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then we have one more right here. This is our last question.
Good afternoon, and thank you to this esteemed panel. For childcare reasons, as someone talked about earlier, I could not come as early as I wanted to because I have to be a mom and a professional woman and an organizer. And so I come here with my question, but first, acknowledging all of you for your passion and your great work and commitment here. I'm joined by my neighbor and friend and delegate, Kim Taylor, as well. And we formed the Fair and Unbiased Appraisal Advocates in 2020, I think it was. And it was frustration from neighbors who weren't getting fair appraisals for our homes. And we took our professional work, I work in communications and strategy, and I've supported nonprofits over the years and corporations, and I've worked with the federal government. We took our frustrations and our passion and our intellect to make noise, to bring awareness to the problems that continue to exist in our county. But we're at a pivotal moment where we need the expertise, we need the relationships, we need the advice and the guidance beyond this moment from all of you so that we can take the work that we're able to do and the ideas that we have to create actual measurable and tangible solutions, but execute them. So we know that federal government has a place. We know that local government has a place. We know that organizing has a place. We know the industry, the appraisal industry, the realtors, the lenders, all have a place and a space. And we have really good ways to dismantle this so that folks can have that American dream of home ownership at the right value of their homes. The problem is we don't have a mechanism to execute those ideas right now because we have our cage number, we know how to do the work, we have the contacts, but there's a disconnect in formally perhaps qualifying, based on the way the structures are set up now. So my question is, from an innovation standpoint in part, how were you able to break through? What advice do you have for us? And we would love to connect with all of you and everyone here, quite frankly, after this, because we want to create measurable outcomes. We've started, but we've got a long ways to go. So thank you.
Okay, that's
Okay.
a pretty large menu
You want to figure out how to answer all these questions?
So we're talking about how do you scale up reparations. Then we are talking about the well-being gap, the opportunities to do something now. What are those? And then what are the mechanisms essentially to ensure that we get fair appraisals and that we're able to act on the kind of discrimination that's operating in that market. So I'm going to let...
But can you do us a favor? Rashawn Ray, who's written extensively on reparations, is it possible he can address that? And he's our colleague. We wrote a
Yep,
paper.
absolutely. I was going to turn it over to...
oh, sorry.
I was going to turn it over to
All right, thank you.
both of our colleagues here.
This is great. You all are phenomenal. Rashawn Ray, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Andre and I have written extensively about reparations and the way that we think about reparations, including what we think is a 21st century New Deal for Black Americans, which includes looking at home ownership, which includes looking at education, and also includes looking at business ownership. We know that a century ago, that part of the reason why the middle class looks like it does today is because there was a nest egg created from the New Deal that Black people who were veterans coming back from World War II and also individuals who were working in domestic and farm work were excluded. We know that Field Order 15, issued out by General Sherman, was set up to create 40 acres and a mule that Black people never got. So part of what we have aimed to articulate, whether that's from Evanston, whether that's in California where we've talked to, Asheville, I mean, the list goes around the country. We're seeing this bubble up. One of the things that Cory Booker always says is that change doesn't come from Washington, it comes to Washington.
That's right.
So what's happening locally and at the state level is building up. In education, this looks like loan forgiveness. It also looks like grants for tuition. When it comes to housing, it looks like down payment assistance. We just heard from you all, that particularly Andre's work, that down payments is one of the biggest issues that's happening here. So that is a way to address that. But we also need housing revitalization for all of the Black people in particular who are in neighborhoods like in Baltimore that are keeping these neighborhoods alive, Detroit, Memphis, St. Louis, the Great Migration North, to be able to stay in their homes and build up their communities. And finally, we need individuals to be able to get capital for their businesses. And one thing Andre always says, and I hope he'll talk about the work he's done looking at Yelp and the ways that Black people's businesses are rated just as well, if not higher, that Black people's ice is just as cold. And so part of thinking about that is we need that money to actually be given to these businesses to build up capital and actually allow for people to be hired in local communities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rashawn. You want to address? Yeah.
You should have been up on this panel, Rashawn. All right. But this is one more opportunity to bring John Legend out for y'all. So I would say, I think your two questions up front, my suggestions on how to kind of influence change, it's not revolutionary. You might feel like, well, I knew that, but this is what worked for me. One is when you have an idea from one person, the first thing you need to do is to coalition build, to build your base. And so with parity, that was the first 8 people who said they would buy a home who were then 40, who were then 600, because from a political standpoint, it makes it a lot more difficult for the elected officials to ignore you because that's their voter base. The second is to tell your story. I mean, Andre, I think you put the appraisal bias issue on the map, you know, and every article was Andre Perry, you know? This man knows how to tell a story. And that, I mean, the stories that, you know, you can recall it off the top of your head, Black homeowners getting an appraisal and it coming in low, and then they remove the pictures from the walls, put up some ambiguous, and have a white friend stand in for them, and suddenly their appraisals are $300,000 more. That's a story. And change, yes, it happens at the legislative level, but it also happens when there are mindset shifts and the narratives that we tell ourselves in our collective story. So that's 2. And then the third, I'm forgetting, so I'll get back to you on that. But yeah, I think those are like the top 2 ways that you start to move the needle.
Great, thank you so much. Renelle or Lorella, anything else that you wanted to add?
I wanted to take on your question about what can happen now and just bring us back to how much money is moving to the states because of implementation and the role that you can play as an elected official in helping to validate what people are asking for, helping to convene people so that they develop a set of demands. 1 in 3 people in the United States is not going to have access to drinkable water in the future because of climate change. And there's a lot of money moving into the states because of IRA. And so what do we need to do? What can people do now in their states to actually help to put a dent into that and so that the future looks different? On childcare, the same is true. Minnesota is poised to have a major breakthrough this year. So I would ask, because it can be case specific, like what are the issues that people are knocking on your door for? And how can you help be a vessel for that change? Because I was undocumented and spent a lot of time worrying that the police would pull us over and what that would mean for me and my family, whether or not I would come home to my mom, whether my mom would show up from work. There is also a work for local government to intervene and to sever the ties between local police and federal immigration agents. And so there's just a menu, right? Like the list is long in terms of what's actionable today that actually improves people's psychological well-being and their sense of worth in this country. And that calls them to being a part of rewriting, right, the story about what is the America that is possible that we still have not yet achieved. And so I just feel like your role and that of everyone in this crowd, wherever you are and wherever you sit in the ecosystem, that you can really open up the door for people to be able to sit in this kind of stage, right? Or to be able to go and protest at their congressperson's office. Like sometimes it's just as small as actually being able to see someone who's so desperately saying, I want to be a part of making that change happen.
Great, thanks, Lorella. And Renelle, we're going to have Renelle, then Andre's going to say a few words, and then we're going to wrap up everyone.
Awesome. There are 3 things that consistently come up in our research in regards to ways that the city can improve. And one is awareness. A lot of folks are not on the digital platforms, especially the hard-to-reach folks. So we need to have boots-on-the-ground efforts to make sure that there's awareness. There's another component around accessibility. So language accessibility, location accessibility, and just information accessibility. And the other thing, I mentioned it earlier, is the hands-on approach. There's a lot of folks that like the personal touch of human interaction, and we've consistently moved towards detaching ourselves from it, and there's a very strong component that needs to be reconnected to it, right? In the way that we engage each other related to programs and services.
Thanks, Renelle. Andre?
And I'll try to use my, respond to the question about closing the well-being gap and close out this session. I'll be cynical. There's a negative way to close the well-being gap, and that's to lower well-being for everybody, which kind of happened around 2016, around a certain election, right? But what we saw during the Obama election was everyone increase in well-being. It's not necessarily about closing a gap. It's about improving well-being for everyone, right? That there is a standard of living that we can all enjoy. And that's why we are really looking for those places where things are going well. There's civic action on the ground, people doing good work that's having an impact on people's lives. That's where we need to focus. There are a lot of organizations, a lot of people pointing out what's wrong. We're going to point to what's right, what's working. So with that, I want to thank John Legend and our illustrious panel.
Thank you.
For engaging. And I want to thank all of you for coming through on a Saturday. It's been remarkable. Again, thank you, and have a good day.
Andre, I had a thought.
Go for it.
this occurred to me. I was thinking about what I spent the week doing. I wrote the music for a new Broadway musical we're working on. And
Just gonna drop that.
I was speaking with our director and our book writer after we were done, and I was saying there's something very special about theater and the production and the collaboration and the feeling you get when you work on something together, all these different people with different roles coming together, and you all invest so much energy and creativity into accomplishing something together. And there's a certain kind of euphoria you feel when you accomplish it, when you do that first performance and it goes well and all that. And I was just thinking, you know, I think because of just the way society's evolved, people go to church less, people do fewer things together. We need to find ways to do things together in community with each other. And we can be so detached, like you were saying, and there's so many digital ways to meet and digital ways to do this and digital ways to do that, that I think so many people have gotten out of the habit of being in community and connection, human connection with each other. And I think that's probably a source of the, you know, the downgrade in well-being too. And so I feel like we've got to all find ways to work together on things and be in community, in physical touch with each other, and work on things together. So that's my last word for the day.
Thank you, John.
Thank you very much.